Okay. As and when. Okay.
Like a gigantic bull in a china shop, the United States of America has been extremely good at doing something extremely badly, and that is intervening in the Middle East and continuing to cement its role in the Middle East as one of an extremely large bull in a china shop. And before we move on to anything else in this debate, Mr. Speaker, we're going to have to clear up one fundamental fact, and that is religion is extremely fundamentalist in the Middle East. And the last time the Sunnis and Shias ever got control, ever were able to cooperate with each other, were back in the 50s. And we're not talking about the 1950s, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about 950 AD. So what can we tell from this? We can tell from this that religion is extremely fundamental in this case. The religion can never be reconciled between the two pairs, and therefore when the US tries to intervene, it's always going to end in failure, it's always going to end in more terrorism and decreased stability. So what exactly is our policy today? Our policy is the US actively going into more nations like Asia. We're going to say no boots on the ground, no airstrikes, and no military interventions within this. We're also going to say no bases. But we're not talking about things like embassies. We're not talking about things like allowing for things like aid. And we tell you that currently in nations like Iraq and Afghanistan, we're going to gradually withdraw those troops. We're going to gradually withdraw the kind of policies we have, like drone strikes. We think in those cases, no thank you ma'am, we think that our general goal, and all we have to prove to you on team proposition today, is that we're going to decrease terrorism, we're going to increase stability, and we're ultimately going to make sure that the United States of America is a safer nation in the long run. We have three arguments for you today. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how it exacerbates the situation and makes it worse in the Middle East. Secondly, I'm going to talk about self-sustainability going down and the problems of even if we win that the United States can't do anything. And thirdly, my Deputy Speaker Ji Hoon will come up here and talk to you about why the pivot to Asia is so key and why the cost to the United States is not worth it, looking at the opportunity cost. So firstly, onto my argument of how it exacerbates the situation and makes it worse. I have, on the first point, I'm going to talk about why it is a good idea for a better trend in not intervening in these kinds of situations. We taught that in the cases of previous governments like, for example, Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi, the only reason their nations were able to maintain order, decrease terrorism, and increase stability was not because they were inherently good rulers, but it was because they had a dictator who could centralize power, and that dictator could very much control his people and decrease the chance of that country degenerating into a hellhole. So we told you, in fact, when the United States of America intervened into Iraq in 2003 and took out the leader, rather than after what happened after the first Gulf War, and when the US actively increased airstrikes and NATO missions onto Gaddafi's Libya, we think that after that, the reason there is such instability, the emergence of the Islamic State in the Levant is only possible because of the fact that there's such instability after that, and why terrorist organizations are all going into those places, that Gaddafi was only overthrown with the help of NATO, and therefore we're seeing massively big problems with there in terms of terrorism. So we think that in that regard, the general trend should be to stop intervening in those cases, because it exacerbates the situation and it increases terrorism, which is exactly the second layer, which I'm going to go on to this second layer. We're going to tell you that it actually increases terrorism in those nations and it's used as a recruiting tool in those cases. We tell you that it's going to make the US inherently less safer as it increases anti-Americanism within those regions. Because firstly, we tell you that there's going to be inherently collateral damage, whether it be from drone strikes, airstrikes, or boots on the ground. Why is this? It's because if you are conducting any large-scale military operation, you're going to have civilian casualties. And we tell you that if you're an Arab father in the Middle East and the US accidentally or purposely kills your son, you're going to become a terrorist against the United States of America. That's going to inherently increase terrorism. Yes, ma'am.
If the US pulls out of Middle East, that means that we're going to be able to save hundreds or 100 of American lives. But at the same time, that means that we're going to be losing 30,000 or millions of people in the Middle East. Shouldn't we have a responsibility for humanity?
Absolutely not, ma'am. We wholeheartedly reject the notion that somehow we're going to be massacring Middle Eastern people. Let's be clear. It's the US that's sending in those troops. It's the US that caused that mess in the first place. And it's ultimately the United States of America that caused that kind of instability within Iraq. And it's ultimately the United States of America that has caused the problems within the Middle East. We wholeheartedly reject the notion. We think that if Bush never intervened in Iraq, if Bush never went into Afghanistan, we wouldn't be having those problems because Saddam Hussein would be continuing to allow that and continuing to stop Iraq from degenerating into that mess of a place. And we think that we wholeheartedly reject that notion from the very beginning. Furthermore, we tell you that, in fact, this kind of increased terrorism is inherently in and of itself true. What this, according to political scientist Waltzer, he said that 95% of all terrorism is only caused when the foreign occupier is within the Middle East. We think this is inherently the problem. When US troops are within the place and they're actively, accidentally killing Afghan civilians or Iraqi civilians, they're inherently going to increase terrorism against the United States, and we don't think that that should be in the US's interest. Thirdly, we tell you that the US government can never ever allow for a sustained military operation. And what do we mean by that? We tell you that they're going to have to stop at some point, because when the body bags start coming home to the United States, that's exactly when the United States will want to pull out. We already saw this in the example of Somalia, we already saw this example of Iraq, and we saw that George W. Bush's popularity went massively down because of this, and that's exactly why they had to pull out. Now, what opposition side just told you in their point of information was that, oh, this is going out and pulling out will actually cause more civilian casualties. Well, we tell you that, in fact, the US is being forced to pull out right now, which causes even more of a problem, because when they aren't expecting it, they're being forced to pull out, and in that regard, if you never intervened in the first place, you would never have a need to prematurely pull out and therefore cause even more problems in the short term. Yes, ma'am.
But if you think about it, the US is already in the Middle Eastern region, and therefore the anti-Western sentiment has already been created. Now withdrawing will cause even more problems because the US is already vulnerable.
Ma'am, our policy has been clear, and that is to give aid and give organic change to those Iraqi governments. We think that if the US is actively being the ones taking over Mosul, if the US and US boots on the ground is the ones who are actively taking over Baghdad, it's never going to be the same, because it's not the Iraqi government that's going to be the ones taking care of the problem. It's going to be US troops in that region, and when the US troops are going to be forced to pull out, that's exactly when it's going to degenerate into that hellhole. It's exactly when the Iraqi troops are going to be running away. As we already saw in the example of Mosul, right? The Iraqi troops actually abandoned Mosul because they didn't know what to do with it. Morale was low, and because they hadn't gotten the proper training they should have gotten. So, onto our second argument, likely onto self-sustainability and what, even if we win, what's going to happen. We tell you that our fundamental stance today is that a government that is responsible for its own defense is not the same as a government that relies on another government for its own defense. So in that regard, we don't think that boots on the ground and airstrikes will ever do the kind of same role. We think it's never going to be able to sustain it. We tell you that, in fact, in the example of ISIS in Iraq, we tell you that the reason the Iraqi military collapsed right after the US left is because of the fact that, in fact, what happened was that it was the United States troops that took over Baghdad. It was the United States troops that took over Mosul. And therefore, when the US was forced to pull out under popular opinion, it was exactly the Iraqi military that fled the area, and therefore it's never going to be ever be sustainable. It's going to decrease stability and increase terrorism. And the only organic change that can ever happen is when the US gives aid to the national governments of those national governments, and therefore those governments can actively support their own citizens and support themselves, increase their own legitimacy. We're told that when 57% of Americans want the US military to intervene to fight ISIS, and yet less than 57% can actually locate Syria on a map, that still shows something, and it shows that the US public is ignoring the lessons of the past. It shows that the United States is indeed a bull in a china shop, and they must be stopped as soon as possible. Thank you.
Okay. I thank that speaker for his speech.
I'm going to begin my speech with a quote from our previous speaker, Prime Minister Nicholas Kim. He said that we're going to give aid to Iraq after the US pulls out. Now, I don't know about the proposition team, but opposition team, me and Jiyun, don't really have trust in the Iraqi government, nor most of the governments in the Middle East, right? Because the history proves to us that whether the US was there or not before the US intervened, there were numerous humanitarian violations, numerous problems with the dictator, and that is exactly the reason why the US intervened, right? Now, the US is a superpower, it is an intervening force, however, it does not necessarily mean that the US just intervenes to the Middle East for no reason whatsoever. We intervene in terms of casualties, we intervene with the troops and bases when we see that there are problems with the reforms that are happening in the governments, or the corruption that is happening in the government, and therefore we think it's simply absurd to see that the proposition would like to come up here and say that U.S. caused all the problems in the Middle East, and if U.S. pulls out the Middle East, everything will be solved. And we think that is a very idealistic approach that the proposition took, right? And so in today's debate, ladies and gentlemen, we think there are some clarifications that have to be made for team proposition. We want to think that the two standards that we must keep when we say that the U.S. can pull out are the following two. Firstly, is there public sentiment in the Middle East? Now, in order to answer this question before any of the things that I would like to go into, we think there is a public sentiment in the Middle East before, unlike in the history, right? We think in the status quo, because of the ISIS or because of terrorist attacks, because of the public opinion, we think there is a certain number, or a certain amount of public sentiment in order to go into the Middle East and actually have troops in there, right? But more importantly, and gentlemen, we think another standard that has to be kept is the national interest of the U.S. We think in this particular we think that because the U.S. has a unique capacity, we must also have the U.S. having a unique responsibility, right? Ladies and gentlemen, because the U.S. was not simply created to become this hegemonic power in the superpower nations of all the world countries, we don't think that the U.S. should simply say that because we have 17 trillion debt, we're simply going to ignore all the people in the Middle East. We have a unique capacity to help people, and that's also the reason why we have a unique responsibility, which I'm going to go into my second argument. And ladies and gentlemen, for the previous two standards, we would like to say that proposition is simply here neglecting the reasons why the U.S. has intervened. And I'm going to go into the three rebuttals, but the three arguments I will be proposing are the following. Firstly, what does U.S. presence in the Middle East actually mean? And what kind of reaction does that trigger in the Middle East, right? Secondly, I'm also going to talk to you about the national security and what kind of benefits that we can have from the U.S. actually staying in the Middle Eastern region. And thirdly, Jiyoon is going to elaborate on the effects of the U.S. actually withdrawing from the Middle East. But before I go on, yes, sir.
The Boston Marathon bomber and the Times Square bomber both justified their attacks with drone strikes from the United States. How are these United States policies actively helping the United States when they're actively encouraging terrorist attacks upon the United States?
That's perfect, because that's exactly what I was going to go into, right? So the three rebuttals I have for team proposition are the following. Firstly, the terrorist attack that Nicholas just mentioned. Secondly, about their organic change, and thirdly, about how religion is irreconcilable, right? So the first point, terrorism basically exists, and the only reason why terrorism actually exists is because the U.S. is intervening. Now, first, ladies and gentlemen, let's think of this in a very practical manner. Already terrorism has occurred, right? Or already the U.S. has intervened, terrorism is already in there. Just because the U.S. pulls out right now in this situation does not necessarily mean that all these people are going to be suddenly appeased. In fact, what we're going to see is that because the U.S. will show that, or you know what, we're kind of scared of you by pulling out of these air bases and showing that they don't necessarily want to be a part of this war anymore, that's going to only tell the terrorists that they have more power to get back at the United States. And therefore, we don't necessarily think that terrorism attack is actually going to be lessened in your situation. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, I also want to talk about the organic change that the team proposition has been bringing up, right? Now, organic change, what Nicholas mentioned, was also in correlation with how they're going to allow these we're going to allow these corrupt governments to actually be aided by the U.S. and therefore suddenly have changes, right? Well, firstly, as I mentioned in the introduction, we should not have such high hopes or high trust in these Middle Eastern governments who have continuously violated human rights. But secondly, gentlemen, we think the organic change that the proposition is very leading into is very, very idealistic for the following reasons. Because we think that in the history proved to us that when Gaddafi was not necessarily intervening in the when the U.S. actually didn't intervene into the Gaddafi situation in Libya, we continued to see humanitarian violations. Even if when we did intervene into Libya, although the situation was of peace to a certain extent, we still saw humanitarian violations, right? We don't think the U.S. actually triggered these violations. The violations happened because of the dictators, because there wasn't enough democratic reforms happening. And therefore, we think that the only solution to this is by having the U.S. going in there and showing that the U.S. cares about this situation and there must be a certain reform. And secondly, that humanitarian violations are unacceptable, which is not shown in the proposition's case. Please sit down, sir. But thirdly, religion is irreconcilable and therefore U.S. should simply give up. Now, this is the introduction that Nicholas actually gave up in a very slow manner, right? We think that this is entirely absurd because we think just because religion or anything is irreconcilable, that we simply give up on that particular problem is something that no government, especially the U.S. should not take. Why is that true? Because when we look at history, even the United United States. North and South were not able to be reconciled during the Civil War. However, we did not simply say that we're just going to separate the country because we saw that there must be compromises that we're going to continue to fight in this particular area, right? So instead of giving up, we resolve the situation, and we think that is exactly what we need in the U.S. government, right? Simply to say that this is not going to happen, we're not going to be able to have a complete compromise, and therefore give up is a way to say that we're just going to lose the situation and have more casualty at the end of the day. Please sit down, sir. And now I want to move on to the two arguments that I have in today's debate, right? So firstly, what does U.S. presence in the Middle East mean? And secondly, national security. First argument, what does U.S. presence in the Middle East mean, right? Well, first and gentlemen, we think that U.S. presence, just simply being there, air bases, drones, whatever you name it, we think it's going to have a tremendous effect in the region in itself. Because that means that the U.S. is willing to attack, willing to defend, willing to do something when a crisis happens, right? For example, when Russia attacked Karazi, or a city that Brett mentioned wonderfully in his speech, we think that the reason why they did it was in order to make sure that they want to check whether the U.S. is going to be idle or not idle, right? The same thing happens with their air bases or bases in the Middle East, right? If we pull out of the bases from the Middle East, that is symbolically saying that U.S. is not going to intervene in these matters anymore. And when we simply say that U.S. is not going to intervene, what happens? The Middle Eastern countries who have been restrained by the U.S. military presence is simply going to be like a horse without a chain to the neck, right? It's going to run around wildly without any restraints to have, or without restraints because they now feel that they won't be attacked. How does it actually link to the U.S. impact, right? Because in the status quo, the reason why the ISIS is unable to simply kill off millions of Americans when they could is because the U.S. is actually going to probably intervene if millions of American citizens are killed, right? That's exactly why we think that the public sentiment against certain ISIS is also very, very crucial, which is exactly what I want to move on to my second argument, national security. We think in the status quo, the reason why the U.S. allows the Kurdish soldiers to be aided to fight the ISIS is because firstly, we have the public sentiment. And that public sentiment allows the U.S. to go into these places and protect their citizens. And that's entirely important because since 9/11 in 2001, we have continued to see the public outrage in these particular regions, especially in the United States, showing that U.S. is not going to be simply succumbing to these regions, right? However, also, we would like to say that even if the U.S. national security cannot be protected because the U.S. has a responsibility as a great superpower, we would like to say that U.S. has the capacity and the responsibility in this region. Thank you. I'll just do this.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that. Now we welcome the...
I can't wait.
Nicholas, you put them in a little bit.
Sure.
Okay,
This is
DPN.
my argument.
Huh?
This is my
Oh, it
argument.
smells so good.
I know, right? Oh.
I don't think I'm gonna get the extra prize for time management.
I don't think anyone's, at the moment the prize is being
Yeah, I don't think
withheld.
anyone's getting a prize for
Maybe Jiwan's gonna claim the prize.
여기까지 안 했으니까 아무것도 안 써.
Oh, it smells so good.
이거 하나 봐. 근데 이것도 다른 있어.
Okay.
이게 왜 이래서
Oh,
이게 왜
Well, you don't have to have it fully open.
Oh.
Middle Eastern reaction trigger하고 왜
Yeah, okay.
중요한지.
It's important to remember that the ultimate goal of the United States is to maintain peace, as already states. And
Here,
already
here.
Nicholas came up and talked about the very moment in which the Bush administration said that they will intervene in Iraq. That was the exact moment in which it led to a dismantlement of peace. And we believe that when opposition simply brushes away this issue, saying that that is the past, we believe that what we must be doing is upholding what we should be doing right now.
Here,
Now,
here.
what are we going to be proving as the proposition today? Number one is already Nicholas talked about the international interests of the United States. I'm going to be reiterating upon the point about how we achieve more stability and less terrorism at the end of the day. But secondly, another very crucial aspect or pillar that is not focused by the opposition is the domestic interests of the American citizens. And that is another aspect that I'm going to be bringing in my third argument later on. But let's first explore some of the rebuttals that came to the leader of opposition in the first place. So regarding her first point, she talked about how the U.S. presence in the Middle East is so crucial and it plays such an important effect, like a tremendous effect in terms of symbolism or whatnot. Well, I have, in order to rebut to this argument, two very important questions that must be asked. So number one is the U.S. troops effective in the first place? And is having the bases and these soldiers very effective in the first place? And we believe that that is really not the case. We believe that ISIS is an actually force that can actually be eliminated whenever we think we can eliminate them. We believe that ISIS, compared to the million and billion of soldiers that exist in the United States, we believe that ISIS has no military power in the first place. So as long as we try to eradicate this force, we believe that is clearly possible. But we believe that, more important on the second question of the symbolic meaning, we believe that the very reason why ISIS continuously takes such brutal measures in the first place is because of the presence of the United States troops in the first place. We believe that although they talk about the symbolic meaning and about how United States troops plays an important effect in deterring these conflicts, we believe that that is actually the very cause in which it exacerbates ISIS, and ISIS uses this as a justification to further recruit more members and to establish ISIS as a greater force. We believe that the very reason that the United States is existing in the Middle East serves as a loophole for ISIS to develop even further. And we believe that is the exact reason to actually rather compromise to a certain extent with ISIS, or to have some sort of effect. We believe that what we actually should be doing is reducing the military presence in terms of these troops or these bases, right? But it is important to remember that doesn't mean that we're going to reduce the leverage in the Middle East. As Nicholas has already pointed out, we are still going to be having these negotiations, and we are still going to be sending aid or whatnot, which clearly means that it doesn't mean that we're going to completely give up on totally regarding the Middle East, but we still hold this leverage through other means, right? But it's just that we don't have these troops, which are completely unnecessary in the first place. But moreover, on our second argument, which is not substantiated at all, regarding the national security, right? He talked about the public sentiment for the Middle East, but a crucial factor that was omitted was the domestic sentiment. And we believe that, as I'll later elaborate, if the citizens are the ones opposed to actually having Middle Eastern troops, we believe that that is the exact moment in which this idea of national security does not stand. After all, what we want to appease is the very own United States citizens. And so we see that under these two claims, both of these arguments do not stand at the end of the day. But let's also go on slightly rebuilding what came from Nicholas, right? So he gave two arguments. Number one, regarding the exacerbation of the situation, about how the Bush administration, for example, was the very cause in situations like Iraq, right? And we believe that when these arguments were not adequately rebutted upon. So what we heard from the leader of opposition was regarding this practical aspect, right? And on her first level, she talked about just because we reduce troops does not mean that we will suddenly appease the Middle Eastern citizens. And although they may not be appeased, ladies and gentlemen, what we say is that at least what we should be doing is a more strategic plan for the United States. And we believe that this rather is the reason why ISIS is developing, for example, in the first place. And we believe that the very moment in which we take out our troops, that is the exact reason in which we can become more, we can gain more leverage or whatnot. But regarding the second argument about self-sustainability and about how it will cause dependency, we also saw a lack of engagement. The only thing we really heard was how we have no hopes for organic change. But we believe that, for example, in places like Iraq, although we are not saying that Saddam Hussein was the best, what we do say is that at least it is better than what is happening in the current status quo. For example, if the United States had not established that power vacuum in Iraq, we believe that at least it wouldn't have been as worse compared to what happened like 50 years ago, at least when there was some sort of centralization within the government. We believe that the very status quo that we have today, in which there was a power vacuum and more instability, which is not what we want to achieve, is the very reason why organic change is the goal we should be aiming for, and at least it is better than the power vacuum that is currently existing in the status quo. But last but not least, before I move on to this argument, was regarding this idea of irreconcilability, about how, for example, two groups such as the Shia and Sunnites or whatnot will not be able to collaborate, right? But we believe that just because there are troops in the Middle East does not mean that these two groups don't fight, right? We believe that these fights and conflicts are still going on, even though the US troops are existing in the Middle East. So just because the US troops exist in the Middle East does not mean that suddenly all of these conflicts will be prevented and everybody will live in harmony, in which these religious groups of Shia and Sunnites will live in peace. We believe that is clearly not what happens, and it only exacerbates the situation in the first place. So that is why we say that the US can do nothing to solve this ethical issue that Nicholas has already pointed out, and we absolutely heard no engagement about how the US is going to do nothing to actually solve these ethical issues that exist in the region in the first place. Last but not least, in order to preserve time management, let me go on to my final argument regarding opportunity costs. So there are numerous layers that come in this argument, but there are some principles that we need to establish before actually achieving how we can go on achieving opportunity costs. So firstly, we need to realize that there is a massive debt in the United States. There are $17 trillion that is being wasted on military expenditures, with more than $620 billion being annually wasted on things like bases or troops. We believe that the very moment in which we reduce these troops and bases from the Middle East, we can significantly cut the massive debt that is caused by these military expenditures. And we believe that when the American citizens go to actually the polls to vote or whatnot, we believe that they really do not have foreign policy as their priority and utmost interest. We believe that what they rather care about is their children going to college and them getting a job with higher pays or wages or whatnot. We believe that foreign policy is last on the issue. And we believe that the very moment in which you don't care about what the citizens want and send over troops, that is very harmful. But another principle to establish, before I move on to how we can actually achieve opportunity costs, is that there is a lack of necessity. Why? Because we believe that not only is domestic interest more important than international interest, we believe that the current society or the current global trend is that just because US troops exist in the Middle East does not mean that US gains more leverage. We believe that it only fuels more anti-sentiment among regions that are nearby, like for example places like Israel. We believe that since the majority of those are Muslims, we believe that it only fuels more anti-US sentiment for these nations. And we believe that what the US should be doing in today's modern society is shifting its focus to the Asian region. And now that I've established this, let's go on how withdrawing Middle East can drastically change the issue. So first level of the domestic interest, we believe that we can actually prioritize the money for the American citizens, right? Because after all, this is a zero-sum game. By reducing the military expenditures, we can prioritize the interest for the citizens. So actually things like jobs or actually children going to college can be more prioritized by reducing the unnecessary Middle Eastern troops. But last but not least is the pivot to the Pacific. And we say that when places like China are the ones that are rather growing in today's modern society, we believe that what we can do is isolate China and check China's power by actually investing more of our money towards the Asian region, by actually doing a pivot to the Pacific movement or whatnot. We believe that although like Middle East is no longer important to the United States, it can still gain its leverage by shifting its focus towards places like Asia, in which it can gain even more influence internationally. So for these two reasons, both domestically and internationally, we are more than proud to propose today's motion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that speech. That was an entry for the time management prize or not, but
I'm serious, do the intro. Okay.
What intro?
Are you doubling up for a whip speech too?
no, we're not going to do opposition right now.
Okay.
Unless you want to. No, we're not going to bother with opposition right now.
Alright, there's gonna be time.
Wait.
Yeah,
I'll just feedback.
No, just for time.
Oh,
Sorry.
oh, wait, what? Okay, never mind.
It smells really.
Okay, so now we're welcome to give what is going to be a great intro, I'm sure.
No.
Hello. Yeah. We've got the thumbnail anyway. Okay, come on. Buddy here.
Hey. Christmas.
Well, Frenchman. You look like Frenchman with a striped t-shirt. And a beret. Some
Interesting.
onions. Yeah. Okay, ready? Go.
Mr. Speaker, with the Deputy Prime Minister not taking any POIs, we take great shame on them because we had a lot to talk about their argument, not because it was repetitive, but also because we think that it is very important to clear several things up. And we thought, number one, it is not against United States citizens' sentiment to really go inside and militarily intervene in these regions, because we have recently seen many cases where the public grew very angry about ISIS, public grew very angry about many things that are happening inside Middle Eastern regions. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, we think that public sentiment is not against. But furthermore, we think that there is a practical interest that US has on this Middle Eastern regions as much as they have towards Korea, as much as they have towards other regions which they have bases, if no more. Therefore, we think that it is very necessary that we have bases as well as these targeted aerial strikes we already have and maintain on this region. So before moving on to my argument about why military intervention
Before you
also
move on.
leads to practical influences of US within diplomatic and economic issues, let's first move on to several issues that came out in today's debate. Number one question is about how we can fight terrorism better. Now they talked about several things. Number one, they told you about how they are religiously fundamentalist, how it's really hard to achieve reconciliations through these regions. Now Mr. Speaker, as our Prime Minister, Leader of Opposition has already clarified, we're not willing to have any kind of religious stance or religious reconciliation that happens through these regions. We don't think that it is necessary to empower any religion, empower any sects, because we think that it is fundamentally impossible to do so, and there is clearly no perpetrator in this kind of context. But what we really want to do is stop the perpetrator, the clear perpetrator that we see right now, such as ISIS, who causes civilian casualties, to stop it from exacerbating even more, or at least strike the appropriate balance. And that is why we think it is very necessary without really having any stance towards religion. But furthermore, they talked about, Mr. Speaker, about how there are collateral damages, and because there are collateral damages, there's going to be more people joining IS. Now, Mr. Speaker, we have two rebuttals. Number one, we tell you that this is a targeted aerial strike, and the fact that we are trying to minimize the collateral damage and civilian casualties as possible. But secondly, more importantly, we think that collateral damages and these little citizens joining terrorists organizations are much less significant than what we fear when US will really pull out of these regions. Because what we are doing right now is trying to degenerate the focus of the whole organization. What do we mean by this? We think that these military bases, the focus or the leaders are not motivated to continue these terrorist organizations because they got their moms killed, because they got their dads killed during drone attacks. It's because of political reasons that is not going to be eliminated just because US pulls out. We think that that is the fundamental reason why we think it's much more important to US to stay in there, try to degenerate their military focus rather than really being fearful about really being feared by several people joining IS and therefore being really big cost. That's why we think that drone attacks, whatever these terrorist organizations say that it's their justification, doesn't really matter because it's only nominal. What they really hate is just America itself, not really what they're doing, their drone attacks or whatnot. We think that it is still going to continue. That is why we think it is much more important for US to invest on degenerating the head focus rather than being fearful about people joining IS. But secondly, but moreover, they told you how it only harms the United States as these terrorist organizations is going to really have problems, and therefore it's going to be really empowered in that sense. We think that that fundamentally does not matter, and we think that this is not an initial decision that the United States is making. They already made a decision to opt in, and now they're taking back that decision, and they're pulling out from the military intervention. We think that this directly means that they're not going to intervene further, but furthermore, we think that this means that they are now giving up. They're condoning these things happening inside these regions. We think that this is further going to stop the organic change, whatever they want as happening, because we think that it is fundamentally the United States who are giving the power to the opposition, mainly like the Kurdish forces, but we think that these Kurdish forces we're having back from United States. So we think that if United States pulls back, we think that these people, these oppositions is also degenerated. But furthermore, we think that they were also the key actor in leading this attacks against ISIS, and also they were pressuring other nations to do so as well. And we think that this is also going to lead to less incentive of other nations who had stake with the United States, who had relationship with the United States in that matter. That is why we think that this will lead to long-term causes that is very significant, that will be very significant in empowering and leading to proliferations of these terrorist organizations, which we deemly want to take away. Yes.
If your side is so concerned about instability in these nations, would you support massive tank operations, massive invasions of US troops into various nations with unstable problems and stay there forever?
We think that these massive tanks and troops are unnecessary in these kind of operations because we think that we're only trying to strike the appropriate balance. We don't want these regions, we don't want these terrorist organizations to grow further, but we also want to maintain our influence in that region. We think it's nominally important that US is actively intervening, not in the fact that there's huge outcome in the sense that these ISIS will topple down or anything. That is why we think it's much more important, and pulling out will exacerbate this problem even more. But then they told us that, oh, okay, aids in negotiations is very necessary, and this will eventually lead to organic changes. We have two rebuttals. Number one, Mr. Speaker, they told you how these terrorist organizations are expert at using propagandas and using that against Western government and using that as a tool to recruit more soldiers. We think that this is exactly what they will continue to do, because just because United States get away military interventions and continue to have any aids or negotiations with the government is not going to take away the justification for these terrorist organizations to continue their propaganda. They're still going to use it. The only difference is that there aren't any practical damages against IS. That is why we think that problem is still going to continue, whereas there's not much of a positive effect that we tangibly have against ISIS. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, we tell you that aids in negotiations, we don't know who we should really negotiate with, who we should have an aids with, because we think that it is very, very important to identify who is the perpetrator and who are we going to empower in that sense. Because we think that if we empower Iraqi government, if we empower al-Assad, we think that they're also the perpetrators. And the problem with the world power is that we don't really know who to empower in that sense, because all of them are perpetrators, all of them were creating humanitarian disasters in that sense. So we are going to ask them and ask the whip to clarify who the government we're going to negotiate with, and in that sense, because we think that it is practically impossible to negotiate with any kind of parties in this kind of complicated situations. So let's move on to my last rebuttal, which is about how this is going to lead to prioritizations. Now, that lack of prioritizations, because they talked about jobs and colleges, then shut down Italy and France, other kind of unnecessary regions, not Middle East, which we have so many stakes. So let's move on to my argument, which talks about how stakes we have. Because we tell you, Mr. Speaker, that this is about negotiations, this is about hegemony of United States and exerting influence towards that region if we have the military bases, because military bases means immediate response and imminent proximity to military responses if there's any extremist groups, if there are any problems that are caused. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, we think that we can secure our trading partners by doing this. We can secure Saudi Arabia or whatever the oil country may be, to really secure and have stable trade with us. That is why we think it is fundamentally important, not only in terms of military, but also in diplomatic and economic need. That is why we're very proud of
Can I start?
Yep.
So, Mr. Speaker, basically the primary argument the team opposition is selling in today's debate is this emotional appeal about terrorism, about, lives being killed in the Middle East, and about ISIS, and about how if the US moves out, all these thousands of people will be killed by these terrorist organizations and they will suddenly flourish. But what team opposition, in order to run that argument in the first place, what they have to prove to us today, to our policy in today's debate, is first of all, that they have to prove that base camps with soldiers and troops with rifles, the military personnel in that region, they have to prove that these military troops actually have that massive of an influence to the security of that region in the first place. And secondly, they have to prove that with a $17 trillion debt for the United States, do they really have to prioritize those issues over the domestic issues that they have on their own, ladies and gentlemen? So as the proposition whip in today's debate, now I'll give an analysis of today's debate, what did it really come down to? We think that this debate mainly came down to two questions. First of all, for the stability and the security of the Middle East, which side is more beneficial? And secondly, for the US personal benefit and interest for the United States, which side is more beneficial? First of all, for the stability and the security of the Middle East. So basically, the argument that team opposition has been telling you is that, if we actually committed to that region in the first place, the US should still stay there, and we should actually help and try to degenerate the damage and to degenerate those terrorist organizations that are happening there and stabilize the overall region. But the fact of the matter is, that has not been happening until now, and that is not going to happen, ladies and gentlemen, because they say say, they gave examples of Iraq and how, Saddam Hussein is a very, bad man, and how those human violations were happening. But the fact of the matter is that the purpose of U.S. intervention in the first place was never to stabilize the government in the first place. Because building a stable government was never their actual motive. They talked about the Iraqs, but the fact of the matter is that human violations weren't the reason the U.S. came in the first place. The reason that they intervened was because they wanted to search for those WMDs that they thought they existed. But the fact is that they didn't exist, ladies and gentlemen. The reason the U.S. goes into those places in the first place has nothing to do, they are not incentivized to stabilize the government in the first place. So what happens at the end of the day is that because of, first of all, they don't have an actual reason or motive to stabilize the government, and also because public sentiment prevents them from actually committing into that region and stabilizing the government for a long time, what happens is, after a few years of intervention, the U.S. tends to move out because of that public sentiment, because of their original motive, ladies and gentlemen. So what we tell you today is that going in and wreaking havoc, and then simply moving out to cause a power vacuum and cause more havoc and more warlords and terrorists to grow up, ladies and gentlemen, we think that this is ultimately worse for the stability of that region, ladies and gentlemen. And moreover, Team Opposition simply neglects the actual capacity of the U.S. They talk about the unique capacity of the U.S., but the fact of the matter is that U.S. is extremely economically unstable. They have a $17 trillion debt, ladies and gentlemen. This not only means that they can't actually, do those projects, but it also means that they cannot actually, they can't actually commit to the stabilization of that region because they simply don't have enough money to do so, ladies and gentlemen. So at the end of the day, they don't have the capacity to actually work for the stability of those governments in those regions, but they actually cause a power vacuum at the end of the day, and that's exactly why we believe this damages the stability of that region as a whole. And moreover, let's talk about the security in it specifically, because their basic premise is that those troops and bases have a massive impact on the security in the first place. But what we tell you today is that in the 21st century, the physical presence of the U.S. troops, basically the soldiers with rifles, doesn't have that massive of an impact in the first place. For example, the ISIS, they have U.S. bases right near their region, but they still actively commit their terrorist activities, ladies and gentlemen. Because in the modern days, those terrorist activities don't really rely upon the U.S. presence in the first place. They don't really care whether U.S. troops stay there in the first place, ladies and gentlemen, because those troops, those individual military personnel, and those actual physical presences don't actually have that of an impact on the security in a practical manner, ladies and gentlemen. Because what actually caused the stability, or what actually prevented actual war from happening in the Middle East, were things such as the political pressure and the leverage on those Middle East countries, and also the economic support for the Israel, ladies and gentlemen. It wasn't the actual troops with the rifles that actually prevented war in the first place. And that's exactly why we don't believe in their logic in saying that if the U.S. troops come out, suddenly thousands of people will die because of the ISIS and because of all those terrorist organizations. Yes, ma'am.
If you're so afraid that people are going to have anti-Western sentiment by intervening, then why are you so for negotiations or aids in terms of intervening, as your second speaker said?
What?
If we're so against people having anti-Western sentiment and therefore we should withdraw from the Middle East, why is it that the second speaker came up and explained to us that we should have aids in negotiations with these people?
What we're saying is that the largest influence that causes those anti-Western sentiments in the first place from the eyes of those nations and those citizens is those bases, the physical appearance of troopers roaming around their streets in the first place. So even before any of those negotiations, the number one influence that we have to solve in the first place is removing those troops in the first place. That's exactly why we care about that anti-Western sentiment. And then they talk about the overall accusation that we're actually giving ways for more terrorism increase in that region as a whole. But the fact of the matter is that basically we have two responses. First of all, we say that if we look at the status quo with the ISIS already, their situation, their model doesn't actually solve that situation anyway, because the ISIS is conducting their activities whether or not the US troops are there or not. So basically, their side doesn't have an actual advantage in solving those terrorism organizations in the first place. But secondly, we believe that the ISIS isn't that big of a threat in the first place, because the ISIS is simply not as powerful and it doesn't have the capacity to kill thousands of people in the first place. The ISIS army is half of the number of the army of the Iraqi government, and they're already combating pretty much effectively the ISIS on their own, ladies and gentlemen. So we don't really believe that the US army is actually having a massive influence on the security of that region in the first place. Rather, we say that it actually leaves more way for it actually increases the rhetoric for those terrorist organizations, as we said. Because they simply say to those people, for example, the 911 and the ISI's current rhetoric that they're running, the logic that they're running to their people is, look at those troops, look at those Western people intervening in our country, look at those soldiers with weapons. That's how they're recruiting their people in the first place. Take a seat, man. And Ji-yoon comes up to this podium and simply says that even if the US troops leave, the ISIS will still continue to use their logic about how the anti-Western sentiment. But the fact of the matter is that the very fact that the US openly states that they're going to move out of the Middle East, that they state that they're going to stop the intervention in the Middle East, and the very fact that the troops and the bases that these people saw in those base camps are gone right now after this policy, pretty much proves that anti-Western sentiment will not be as effective as it was before, ladies and gentlemen. So that's exactly why, first of all, for the security and the stability, we don't think that the US physical appearance in that region has that much of an effect. But on to the second major issue is about, basically, from the US perspective, which side actually has more benefits. So basically, Lauren comes up to this podium and says that because the US has a unique economic capacity, they should have a unique responsibility. We see that with a $17 trillion debt, they no longer have that unique capacity in the first place. We think that a $17 billion debt and a $650 billion annual spending on military is no joke, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that that money can be effectively spent on reducing unemployment rates and reducing all those economic problems that the US currently has. And moreover, we say that the cost and benefit analysis politically is actually harmful in the status quo. Because basically they say that the Middle East hegemony in the Middle East is actually very important, and having troops there actually has imminent responses that actually increases positive Western sentiments. But the fact of the matter is that we see the ISIS right now having threats in the Middle East region, but the US is not actually conducting those imminent responses anyway. And moreover, we say that the anti-Western sentiment collected by the US president there actually does not contribute to the US hegemony, but it actually harms the US hegemony because of the anti-Western sentiment in general. We say that rather that money and that concentration should be used for the pivot to Asia when China is actually gaining influence and actually those political ties are being reduced from the US perspective, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.